All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a really exciting conversation for all of you today. My name is Tomiquia Moss, and I am the founder and CEO of AllHome California. We're a Bay Area organization working on regional solutions to address homelessness and housing insecurity in the Bay Area. And I also have the pleasure of serving as a co-chair of the Bay Area Council's Homelessness Committee. I'm really excited to be joined today by Geoff Ross. And just for the audience to know, this webinar is public and is being recorded. And we'll publish this webinar on the Bay Area Council's YouTube page when we're finished. Really excited to welcome Geoff Ross, who is the Deputy Director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development. Geoff is responsible for overseeing Project Homekey, the federal state partnership that began under the CARES Act to quickly convert hotels and motels into housing for people experiencing homelessness. Geoff is going to share with us some details of Homekey's successes, some challenges, and what's in store moving forward. After Geoff's presentation, we'll invite members of the audience to submit questions in the Q&A function. We will take your questions after Geoff and I have a discussion and get to as many as we can within the hour. All right, Geoff, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you, Tomiquia, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hopefully not mess this up. No guarantees here. I just want to kind of start off with, helping to kind of frame the context a little bit for the conversation. Can you guys see my screen? Tomiquia, can you see the screen? Great. All right. Then with that, I will go ahead and begin. So often we get the question when we start talking about housing and homelessness is, why do we have so many homeless here in California? And then coupled with that, we have obviously a large need in the community. And then that was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so I want to be able to walk you through quickly how we came to get to Project Homekey, what we were really targeting and going for in the program, and then to be able to share with you what we're hoping to be able to accomplish as we go forward. So key question that always comes up is, why do we have so many homeless in California? And really, I think it's important to note that it really starts with the post-war growth of the state. Back in the 1950s, there's only 10 million people that lived in the state. Today, there's roughly 40 million. And we've experienced this exponential growth at a time when a lot of other things have also been happening. And then roughly around the 1960s is when we also, as a nation and as a state, spent the most per capita that we ever have in terms of housing. And it's been steadily declining from the 1960s to today. And then likewise, in the 70s, we started to see really strong economic growth in the state, as in addition to that population growth. But at the same time, our housing production really began to slow down, comparatively speaking. And then in the 1980s, we had a lot of folks coming back, and we were beginning to understand the long-term repercussions of veterans who were returning from war. At the same time that we also started to decrease our overall support of mental health services. And so a lot of these things kind of were hitting all at once. And then we got to the 90s, and again, economic growth really picked up. And that cycle has kind of continued all the way till we get to today. And so when we aren't producing enough housing, we have robust economic growth, we haven't maybe invested in some of our resources the way that we need to do, we get to a point where we have a large portion of homeless individuals. And all of that also is influenced by some of the policies that we put into place, and some of which were intentional in terms of segregating population and creating disproportionate impacts within the population that also influences what we're having to try and solve for in the moment. And so that gets us to last March, when we really saw the pandemic hit. And so we already had an incredibly vulnerable population out on the streets, not protected, susceptible to illness and other issues. and then you get a virus that is airborne, highly contagious, and we needed to be able to react very differently. Typically, we house folks in congregate shelters, and that honestly just doesn't work when you're trying to combat an airborne virus. And so we needed to be able to move folks into individualized units, into non-congregate sheltering facilities. And so that's where Project Homekey came into effect last spring. It was really a very quick response, an emergency response to the needs of folks that are currently unhoused. And so that was a state-county partnership to really address the homelessness. It was looking at leasing hotels, but it was very much a short-term interim solution, but very successful because over 15,000 motel rooms were able to be secured. We're able to serve over 22,000 individuals, and we're able to really do that across the state, 55 counties, working with 3 tribal nations. And so very quick, very robust response. But that again was a temporary solution, and so really what the leadership of the state wanted to be able to do was to really begin to understand, how do we solve for this? How do we create long-term solutions? And that's where Homekey comes into effect. And so really what we were looking at is to expand these partnerships that we had developed as part of Homekey. And instead of just leasing the motel rooms, really look at, how do we acquire units? How do we bring them on as rapidly as possible? And it can be hotels and motels, and that certainly was the focus of Homekey. But we also knew that it could be apartment complexes. It could be other buildings, commercial. One of the things that we know is that the pandemic has maybe sped up some of the processes that we've already seen going on in our community, with commercial space maybe not being as viable as it once was, because we're going more online in certain activities that we're doing. So all this was helping frame up what Homekey was going to look at in terms of trying to target and to bring more units on very rapidly. And the crux for us was, this couldn't be our normal process. It had to be, we couldn't take 18, 24, 36 months to bring units online. This is emergency. We needed to treat it as an emergency. So again, building off of Homekey, it was, how do we do this? And so really, it all starts with last year with AB 83, and we received $750 million in the Coronavirus Relief Act funding. We received another $50 million in state general fund dollars. Then we received $46 million in philanthropic dollars, and that was, and I want to call out, $25 million from Kaiser Permanente, another $20 million from Blue Shield Blue Cross, and $1 million from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation. Those funds gave us the total of what we were going to be able to deploy in the Homekey program. And again, to be able to make sure that we did this everywhere we needed to do it, we really looked at trying to make sure that we could make sure that we had the right combination of applicants and partners. And so we really looked at a broad definition. So it was cities, it was counties, it was housing authorities, and it was the tribal governments. And they, as the primary applicants, could bring in the additional folks that they needed to be able to partner with, either as co-applicants or whatever arrangement that made the most sense, to be able to get identify projects and get them up and running. And so we also knew that as a state, we had to throw out the playbook. We had to start from scratch. We needed to treat this as the emergency it was, and so we really looked at going through this process rapidly with the partner applicants. And so we looked for a bare minimum type of application that could tell us whether or not a project was going to be viable, but then we knew information could follow, and we set up ambassadors, and we kept trying to make sure that we had really open lines of communication, so that way projects could come together, and we were working in tandem with the local partners to try and be able to make sure that as the funds were available and we were able to enter into contract, and likewise, once that contract was entered into and acquisitions were able to occur, or conversion work could begin, that within 90 days of that executed contract, we could start to see units being occupied. And so the big difference of Homekey versus a lot of other things that we've done in the past, this was an acquisition occupancy program. And it wasn't a traditional acquisition, rehabilitation, new construction. This was really about getting to occupancy very quickly and making sure that we could serve folks appropriately. And so that compressed a timeline unlike we've ever done before. Between July 16th and the end of September, when the application period closed, we brought in over 160 applications. We were able to see, pretty much every community that could mobilize and have a proposal for us to work through with them. And it meant that at the end of the day that we were able to have great coverage throughout the state. Part of this, and the reason why it had to be throughout the state, was because we really were also trying to bake in equity into this program. We needed to make sure that we could hit the rural communities just as effectively as we could hit the big urban communities. Because as we know, homelessness is impacting Californians across the state. And the virus, the pandemic, is affecting all of us across the state. So we really wanted to make sure that there was a geographic equity component, as well as really getting at the racial disparities and the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has been having on our different populations. And we needed to be really flexible. This couldn't be a really rigid, strict type of program like we sometimes have developed in the past. And so we needed to be able to again communicate and work very closely with partners and to understand what it took to get housing occupied very, very quickly. And we did this as we were framing all this up and working. We also collected surveys. We really tried to engage on the front end. And so a lot of these are lessons learned that you're going to hopefully see us be doing as we go forward in our other programs. But at the end of the day, what did we accomplish? We spent that $750 million from the Coronavirus Relief Act from between July 16th and December 30th. Now, some of you might know that the Coronavirus Relief Act funds were actually extended from December 30th to a later date. For us, December 29th, we actually spent our last dollar. So that extension came out and we're like, well, that's great, but we already spent the money. But we spent it on really good things. 6,000 units that didn't exist in July now exist today. And these units are for homeless individuals. These units are studios up to 3 bedrooms. That means at any given time, we are serving around 9,000 Californians. And again, we were able to do this from 90 days at the time that we entered into our agreement and contract with our partners. That means, as of today, all of our sites around the state are getting occupied, that people are living in them. This isn't going to be another year or 2 years until those happen. That's happening right now. And I'm really, really pleased to say that we were able to partner with 51 local public entities across the state, 3 of which were tribes, created 94 projects that comprise that 6,000 units. We had several projects in the Bay Area. One that just like to highlight is one that is in Redwood City in San Mateo County. 95 units, so very, pretty large, but not abnormally large in terms of providing affordable housing. It's starting off interim. It's going to convert to permanent. And that was a really key component to Homekey in terms of that flexibility was we knew that there were sites and projects that could provide immediate assistance and relief to the population today, but they might not be in the condition or the configuration that we wanted as a long-term asset for the next 55 years. And so we wanted to make sure that we respected, that we brought a public facility and an asset to the community that everyone would be proud of for a long period of time, and we needed to create that flexibility. So here's an example of one that starts off being able to serve people immediately, and we'll be able to position to that long term. It has kitchenettes, and it has 1 and 2 bedrooms. It's located on transit, so these are the things that we tried to make sure that all of our projects, for the most part, could have. And I think all of you know that building affordable housing in California is not cheap. Building affordable housing in the Bay Area is not cheap. The one consistency that we saw, no matter where we did this, is that the units we were able to produce, whether they were permanent immediately or interim, converting to permanent, they were $150,000 to $200,000 less per unit than they are in our traditional programs. This project right here, the per unit cost was $325,000 a unit. And so part of that is expediency. Helps take away some risks. It helps defray some costs. We weren't looking to do substantial rehab in the moment. We knew we could occupy, so we're looking at doing repairs. There was land use conformance. There was CEQA streamlining. Again, all these things reduce down the risk, give assurance, and that all helps reduce costs. So again, some very valuable lessons that we learned along the way. And so this has garnered some momentum. The governor in January proposed Homekey 2.0, as we're calling it. It's a second round of Homekey, looking to really build off of these lessons of Homekey 1.0, and looking to really, hopefully have another $750 million in state general fund dollars that would be able to continue this work. Again, looking to continue this partnership to take advantage of the opportunities of whether it's hotel or motel vacant sites, or if it's taking the opportunity of really good vacant public land or maybe undeveloped land just in the community in general, and to bring it into an environment that is high quality and able to serve our most vulnerable very rapidly. We were able to do modular construction. We were able to do mobile home acquisitions and placements. We were able to do some commercial reconfiguration into housing. We were able to do all of these under Homekey in these tight timelines. So Homekey 2.0 won't quite have the same tight timelines, but it's going to have the same urgency. And so we're trying to make sure that we can continue that along those lines. And so we're hoping by July 1st with the new budget that we'll be able to begin implementing a new Homekey round. Sorry about that. I'm hitting different things. There's a lot more information on our website, so you can go to homekey.hcd.ca.gov and be able to look at and see the materials, be able to kind of see a lot of the details and facts that we're able to be put together on all 94 projects and how we structure the program. You can also track movement of Homekey as well as some of our other programs. I think, as you all know, the American Rescue Plan is moving from Capitol Hill over to the White House for the president to sign. So we're going to be launching a few other programs probably here in the very near term. And so you can sign up to track all of these moving pieces on our HCD website. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Tomiquia, and I'm sure we'll have a nice, good conversation.
Well, thank you, Geoff, for that presentation, and it's really impressive to see how quickly this program was able to serve the needs of so many folks during the pandemic. So just starting out, my first question for you is, trying to put a little bit of perspective around Homekey's scale relative to the scale of our neighbors who are outdoors and experiencing. I would contend that, of course, homelessness was a crisis before the pandemic, and it was really exciting to see the governor's office and the agency act so quickly. But I'm curious about, how do you think about the action steps that you took to expedite Roomkey and Homekey moving forward? How do you all think about making some of those changes permanent in our quest to bring on additional supply of both interim and long-term housing for people experiencing homelessness?
That's a really good question, Tomiquia, and it's one that we are constantly, trying to make sure that we're addressing, not only in Homekey, but really taking those lessons learned to all of our programs. We have 150,000 homeless people any given night homeless in California for various reasons, but primarily for the ones that I kind of walked through at the beginning of the presentation. And 9,000 folks being able to be served through Homekey is significant, but it doesn't solve the problem. And it was a crisis before the pandemic. It is a crisis today still, and it will be a crisis until we solve it, right? And the urgency by which we acted is the same urgency that we want to continue to move with our programs. And so we're really trying to you know look at this in a holistic manner. Motel conversions, apartment acquisitions, vacant lot developments with modular or mobile homes. None of this was new, right? We've all been doing this around the state, but we've never done it with the size, scale, and urgency that we did it under Homekey. And so that was the proof of concept, that if we work together and we communicate closely, we knock down the barriers that sometimes get in our way, and really try to listen to each other and address the problems in each of our individual communities, that together as the state and the locals, we can actually make a difference and start to solve this. And that's what we're going to be trying to do in Homekey 2.0, and normalize this into a program that is not an emergency program, but an ongoing urgent program. And it's the same type of thing that we're going to try and do in our other programs, whether it is our block grant and our home or our multifamily housing program. Like, we are trying to take these lessons learned and make sure that we can apply them in a way that gets units produced quickly at a high quality, that is a true asset to the surrounding community and neighborhood, and serves the folks that we need to serve.
No, that's great. And I think that's key, right? Is really applying the lessons learned across your entire portfolio. Like, how do you think about your entire system with respect to this issue is critically important. Um, so, one of the unique elements of Home Key is that you were able to kind of take advantage of the fact that the pandemic was producing an economic crisis that opened up these hotels and motels. At competitive rates, certainly during room key. But imagining that the economy will recover and hotels will sort of fill up and be commercially, used again. What's the plan then? Like, how do you think about how many units will actually be able to be permanently converted relative to what goes back to the private market?
Right. And I think that we are all hoping very quickly that the economy recovers and that we begin to understand a new semblance of normalcy. But it's going to be different than it was pre-pandemic. Again, there were market forces already happening throughout the state, throughout the country, where we were seeing certain types of uses reaching the end of their useful life. Those opportunities are still going to be there. They might look slightly different. They might take some different shapes and form, but there's a lot of opportunity that's going to be there, and that's where we're going to be focusing on that flexibility yet again, because we want to do this in a way that's creative, that is flexible, and really gets at what communities need. And it's the individuals that we're trying to serve, as well as the neighbors of where we're going to be serving these individuals, right? It's making sure we address both, and that's really, really important. So I think there's still going to be ongoing opportunities with hotels and motels, but there's going to be commercial sites that were already reaching their end of their useful life and are in great high opportunity areas, close to transit and to services and amenities that anyone, we would want them to be able to be next to and be able to participate in. And so, making sure that we're open to those. We have vacant and underutilized land, publicly owned or in private spaces. We just have to be open to how do we reimagine and do these pieces. And we need to do it in a way, again, that has urgency. We might not need to have an arbitrary expenditure deadline, but we still need to have urgency. And we still need to understand that one night that there are people being exposed to the elements and not in a safe place is one night too many in terms of what we should accept as a society. And that's what we need to internalize within our operations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that the flexibility for acquisition of vacant, hotels and motels that have exceeded their shelf life, but getting super creative about how do we actually bring on more interim housing, right, that brings our neighbors indoors while looking at permanent exits simultaneously. So that really resonates with me. One of the areas that AllHome focused on during Home Key was trying to think about services, and how do organizations pay for services and operations, given that the home key funds were for capital. How do you think about that in 2.0, or moving forward? How do we pair the capital investments so that jurisdictions and communities can bring on more buildings, but how do we also pair that with services dollars needed to operate the properties?
Right. So we need to look at it, and this is kind of the base foundation framework of why we had the interim and the ability to go from interim to convert to permanent, was thinking about that pipeline. And it's not only the pipeline of development, the pipeline of units, but it is also the pipeline of supportive services and funding around, how do we help make sure that we have the case management and the other functions that really allow folks to become successful and ultimately independent of our assistance. And so as we look at 2.0, what we're trying to really make sure is that we're looping back and coordinating with the applicants under the first round of Homekey and see what's happening now on the ground. How are they going to be integrating overall the new projects into their overall portfolio of activities? And what does that mean for their ongoing pipeline of supportive service funding and capital funding and all of those pieces? Quite honestly, we knew going into Homekey 1.0 that operations was a big deal, services was a big deal. And so what we said is we needed to know that everyone that was going to partner with us while we're going to be providing this capital, that there's 5 years of services immediately attached within the control of that public entity. And everyone that came through the door was able to provide that. We said we're going to try and use our general fund and philanthropic dollars to provide 2 years up front to help minimize that strain on the locals who were putting up that 5 years. And so we were able to successfully do that. Every applicant received at least one operation subsidy award from us. And we were able to provide 67, I believe, if I remember correctly, ultimately 67 of the 94 projects with an operation subsidy. So it wasn't a one for one, but we were able to make sure that each applicant certainly got an award and at least 2/3 of our projects got an award. Now, what we're looking at as we do 2.0 is we probably need to make sure it's a one for one, right? We need to begin to account for, we need to provide that level of support again to make sure that these projects land within the overall funding pipelines and that we can continue to support and do that long-term community asset building, making sure that we are able to serve folks and truly, hopefully, solve episodes of homelessness with the individuals we're seeking to serve.
That's great. Yeah, one of the realities, right, is I often say when capital dollars don't come with service and operation dollars, it's like building a house without your doors and windows. And so really thinking about a more comprehensive approach, I think, is the right one, right? Where you're really leveraging your capital investments and ensuring that people can get their needs met while they're in the housing. My next question, and then I'm going to shift to some of our audience member questions, Geoff, is, many jurisdictions across the state are doing rehousing plans for room key hotels that are closing, and they're looking for permanent exits for the residents who have been occupying the room key hotels and trying to move folks into, available permanent housing or other options in the community. How do you all think about that transition in 2.0? Because we are hearing that it's challenging to find enough, as you talked about in your presentation, to find enough permanent exits for people to actually have a place to go once the room key hotels close. How do you all think about that?
So I think we're getting aided right now with the new rescue package that's about to come through. So first of all, now under the old FEMA reimbursement rules, it was a 75-25. And so that was also leading to why some of the room key hotels hotels were needing to close because locals were starting to run out of that match. Now we have 100% FEMA reimbursement. So if folks weren't aware of that, I encourage you to look at the FEMA rules, because now those hotels, if they're able to stay open a little bit longer and continue to serve this population, there is a 100% FEMA reimbursement. And so that's a critical way to continue to extend this assistance in this moment in time. But there's also going to be new awards of emergency vouchers in the rescue plan that is really going to be helpful and helps in that exit. So we might not have enough restricted units, but if we have the ability to provide ongoing support, we can access the private market a little bit more robustly than what we might have been able to traditionally do. Likewise, we're quickly trying to mobilize, and we're going to be launching on Monday our new California COVID-19 rental relief program, which is the rental assistance program to hopefully make sure that Californians stay housed. So if you're in housing, you don't lose your housing. So we don't add to our ongoing pipeline. And so we're about to mobilize that, and we're getting basically about a double of the amount coming in this new rescue plan. So we're going to be able to really push that out, which is critically important. And then there's also some new HUD programs, one of which some folks on this call are probably very familiar with, the National Home Program. Well, there's going to be a home allocation that's really targeting homeless individuals primarily. And so all of these are allowing us to make sure that we can try to either create more units rapidly or access the private market more effectively. But quite honestly, until we just get more units, because we still are in desperate need of more units, that placement is going to continue to be a struggle. And we want to bring people into service, help get them housed as quickly as possible, and continue to support them however they need, so that over time they become independent and they're back and doing pursuing whatever their abilities and capabilities will allow them to do.
Yes, I agree. I think that, being able to provide the supportive services and the operation support also garners favor with the broader community, seeing this as a resource that's actually helpful to their unhoused neighbors and being able to integrate them into the community. And that leads me to my last question before we go to our audience members, which is, not everybody was psyched about this program. We have several communities across the state who are suing you all to block Homekey projects, despite the locals not having to put any funding toward the projects. How is the state thinking about those impacts, and how do you do community outreach around this program so that everyone sees it as a benefit to bringing their neighbors inside?
Right, and I think that that's always a challenge when you move very quickly. Sometimes you don't have the ability to do that communication and outreach and touch base that we know is so important as we try to do any type of community activity. But I would say this to most folks is, there are a few exceptions to the rule, but primarily speaking, when we look at who's homeless in a community, they're from that community. Roughly 80 to 85% of the homeless that you would see are actually from the area that they're homeless in, right? And so these are our neighbors. These are folks that you grew up with, whether you realize it or not, that have been a part of your community and have had challenging circumstances, whatever they were, that led them to where they're at. And we are all already paying for services for them, but we're not doing it effectively, and we're not doing it in a way that is providing dignity to these individuals, right? We pay for emergency room visits already. We pay for incarceration. We pay for all these different pieces that, quite honestly, are a lot more expensive than housing. And so it is on us to make sure that we do housing that is appropriate. But that's why you've heard me say multiple times that this needs to be a community asset and a facility for the long term. And we just need to continue to engage along those lines, because I've heard it so many times in my career that most everyone says they want to help the homeless or those in need, but then they get a little worried about where that help happens. And so part of that is to make sure that they can make that statement and not be as concerned, because they know that they have a true partner in their local government and in their state government that's going to try and create a facility and an asset that is providing dignity to those that we're trying to serve, and is dignified and an asset to the surrounding neighbors.
That's great. All right, so one question from Andrew. He's asking when the Homekey 2.0 NOFA will be available. He had heard from a local state representative that it was as early as May. Is that true? And how can he get a heads up in preparing to compete for the second round of funding?
I never want to get in front of my bosses, so the legislature and the governor will tell us when they have granted those funds, and that's when we will launch the program. It could be an early action. It could be just as part of the normal budget process. So it could be a May, it could be a July 1. But once it does happen, then what we would be doing is much like we did with Homekey 1.0. We will be working feverishly to make sure that we can get the word out, make sure that we're partnering with everyone, and really to identify those projects that are really getting at what we need to do, which is to serve those in need and to bring on a really high quality asset into a community.
That's great. And that sort of is a good dovetail into James's questions, and he's talking about some of the unintended consequences of the Room Key Home Key program, and how it's had some adverse effects on some neighboring businesses in his community, and wondering how do providers in the state think about security and making sure it actually is a community asset for both the people receiving the housing as well as the community at large.
Right. So I know that there's been a few issues in some of our Room Key sites, but it's been very limited, but they have existed. And so, and that's the challenge with the temporary solution. Homekey, again, was trying to make sure that we address those. So with Homekey, what we're critical on is that we need professional property managers and we need professional case managers, and they aren't one and the same. And so it's really important that we engage the right individuals to support the populations that we're trying to serve. That way it also supports those surrounding neighbors, whether they're businesses or their residents and things like that. So hard to do in an emergency environment as rapidly and quickly as we were all mobilizing under Room Key. Still very successful. A few issues. Homekey has really been trying to make sure that we were addressing those in a holistic manner. And so far, I don't want to jinx us, but I think that we've been doing a pretty good job on the Homekey side.
Great. There are a couple of questions, Geoff, asking about sort of mental health support for residents in these programs, and what the state is thinking about with respect to providing adequate behavioral health support for people experiencing a mental health or substance abuse crisis in the projects.
Right. So I think it's important to note that Homekey isn't a one size fits all. We did not say Homekey had to be permanent supportive housing. So some projects are trying to reach really, really deep into the community of need and are dealing with mental health issues and substance abuse issues, because that is truly the population that project is serving. Other ones are really looking at, here are what the homeless population in our community looks like, and we can provide a different level of service and still functionally make sure that we're meeting those needs. And so again, that flexibility is critical. But one thing that's important to note is that the projects are supposed to be supporting the populations that they're serving. So that's one thing that we're trying to make sure is that if a community is going to go deep on a project, that they have those supports, and so that if they're going to go the permanent supportive housing route, that they are able to provide mental health services, that they're able to provide substance abuse services. One key piece is, though, to also remember, getting at folks more quickly helps reduce these needs just from the onset. A lot of folks are homeless without having any mental health or substance abuse issues. And what we know is the longer you're homeless, the more you're prone to have a mental health or substance abuse issue because of the stress that homelessness puts on you. And so we need to address the need for those that have those issues and be able to provide it, but we also need to be able to house people more quickly so that they don't develop those issues. And so it's mental health and substance abuse does not cause homelessness on their own. But I would say that mental health and substance abuse is a side effect of being homeless. So that's an important distinction.
That's such a great point. I'm so glad I was going to raise that up and you did it for me. I think it's really important for the audience to recognize that, in fact, the majority of folks, 2/3 of those experiencing homelessness across the region, and I would gather across the state, don't have severe mental health and substance abuse issues. And so I think you're spot on in distinguishing between what are the causes and how do we provide the right solutions for the people who need it. So thank you for that. Um, Another question from Andrea, who asks about, will HomeKey 2.0 feature the same emphasis on equity with regards to distributing funds across community types, urban and rural? And I would just add on to that question, have you all collected data around the demographics of people who have been served by these programs? And are you in fact addressing some of the racial disparities that we know exist within the program?
So let me kind of bifurcate that. We just got our first reports on the projects at the beginning of February, so we are beginning to analyze that data now.
Okay.
Second of all, equity is at the heart of what we are to do under HomeKey 1.0 and under HomeKey 2.0. I will tell you very clearly, our marching orders are ones that I'm incredibly happy to march to. Is from the governor to the secretary to the director, my bosses up the chain. We are all about equity, geographic and marginalized populations in groups that historically have been disadvantaged. And I won't pretend that we've been perfect, but we are trying to get at this in a very meaningful way that has outcomes and impacts that will hopefully change the trajectory and legacy that we've been dealing with in a positive way. One of the things that we were so proud of and that we are really trying to make sure that we continue to do is to partner with the tribes. That is not something we had done really effectively before, but we're actively trying to do that. Likewise, we have taken a lot of the lessons learned from HomeKey and the way that we try to layer and get at some of this disproportionate impact when it came to the pandemic and how it's hitting folks in different ways. We're trying to make sure that we've learned from the ways that we tried to evaluate that in HomeKey, and we're going to be trying to make sure that impacts our new rental assistance program, that's going to be impacting HomeKey 2.0, that's going to be starting to go into some of our other ongoing programs. And so we're going to continue to focus on equity and try to make sure that we do it better, and that part of that is also listening and making sure that we're doing that analysis. So, and not being afraid to say, maybe we didn't do it right here. And so if there's challenges, I welcome anyone to always reach out and let me know what they're seeing. I know the staff and the team at HCD are completely open and willing to doing that. And I know that my bosses want us to be doing that.
Oh, that's great. And I think the constant vigilance that it takes to assess equity impacts, it should be a part of the process. So I'm really excited that remains a focus for 2.0. There are a couple of questions, Geoff, that speak to the broader issue around the increase in homelessness during the pandemic and this economic recession. Both Fran and Conwall describe increases in encampments in the Sacramento region and in Berkeley that seem persistent. How is the state thinking about, we're just trying to support the people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and our fears around the eviction moratoria ending and June and the cliff that many folks will fall more, many more people will fall into homelessness. How are you all thinking about that looming crisis?
Right. So again, I think that's why we have a proposal for Homekey 2.0 is that we know we need to create more units, and that's being led by the governor and the legislature, really, trying to drive that ability through state resources. Obviously, we're going to be getting an infusion of federal funds. We have an infusion of federal funds that we're already in the process of trying to get out onto the street. So we need to continue to push in so many different ways. Depending where you're at, homelessness has either gotten worse by numbers or it's gotten visually more noticeable, right? And so it's hard for us to ignore the plight of our fellow Californians, and we cannot settle on that it is okay for what we're seeing to be normalized. It cannot be accepted, and so we are very much trying to make sure that we prevent more folks from falling into the system. So the statewide rental assistance program that's going to be running again on Monday, along with a lot of the local ones that some are already operational, some are coming online very soon. We're all trying to get at how do we keep people housed? How do we prevent folks from falling into the system? And a lot of what's going on is tied back to the rental protections in SB 91. Which extended the rental protections out to June, and that's making sure that that we create a path for folks to have some stability, to create some flexibility. And what's important to note about the rental assistance programs is that for the first time, we're also now able to give real resources to those landlords who haven't quite yet had those types of resources. So it's making sure that we're addressing the needs of the tenants and the needs of the landlords all at one time. So again, it's that holistic approach, deploying more tools than what had been in our tool belt maybe before to begin with, but be doing it in a thoughtful manner and trying to make sure that we cover what we know needs to be covered, and we're keeping our ears to the ground if there's if there's a gap that's created, that we become aware of it and we begin to try and address that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the ecosystem includes tenants and landlords, and that the fact that the rental assistance program will be available to both is important. And, what we know from the data is that targeting those rental assistance dollars to the households that need it the most, who are most at risk of homelessness, is where you see the best outcomes. And I realize that, you talked about prevention, and I couldn't agree more. We have to really start thinking about how do we address the inflows into homelessness, but targeting that 0 to 30% area median income households who are most at risk of falling into homelessness is critical. And so we're really excited to be working with you on that because, a lot of folks are hurting right now, and we know not all of those folks will end up homeless. And so if we're able to target those resources as best we can to getting them in the hands of folks that need it the most, we're going to have a much more successful program. So really appreciate that intent. Um, Sherry asks a question about the eligibility requirements for, like, how does somebody get into Homekey, and how do folks get referred? What's the process there?
So what's really critical, and we've been trying to work really closely with our partners across the state because it looks a little different in different parts of the state, but really there's what's known as continuum of cares. These are the organizations in the community that are really out there trying to serve the homeless population and to bring them into shelter and to help find permanent housing solutions. And so what we've asked for as part of Homekey is that all Homekey projects are partnering with those continuum of cares, that referrals from those continuums are going to the property managers for folks to be able to get housing within the project. And so it is that level of interconnectedness between the homeless system of care itself and those that are trying to serve those that are literally homeless, and linking them straight into the program, and making sure that there is a path to occupy these specific units with folks that are or have been homeless.
That's great. James asks a very basic question. We know that a lot of folks were experiencing food insecurity during the pandemic. And his question is, how are meals provided to home key residents? What does that look like?
So it takes different forms. So in our non-congregate facilities, that is a shelter basic environment, but you're not grouped together in one giant room. You have individual units. And so part of a lot of those programs really is making sure that food is available, being brought on site and dispersing it to the population. As we're talking about our permanent housing solutions, we have kitchenettes and things like that in there. And so again, trying to make sure that folks have good access to food and then they can prepare it themselves. But maybe some folks aren't quite there yet. So again, part of the case management and some of the service supports is making sure that food provision is part of it. So it's not a one size fits all. It looks a little different between projects, and sometimes it looks a little different between units. But it is something that we are asking all of our different partners to be actively thinking about. Again, trying to be mindful of who are you trying to serve, how able are they in a particular moment to be able to provide for themselves in a food scarcity type of manner, right? And so all of that is being addressed as we go through these program development and program guidelines.
All right, I think we have time for just a couple more. Pete asks, is there a need to commandeer hotels to support Project Homekey, as some of the elected leaders in Los Angeles has been demanding? I imagine that question is about eminent domain, or how incentives for property owners to sell for the use of this program. How are you all thinking about that?
So we weren't looking to do eminent domain. That was not allowed under the act. And quite honestly, we 94 projects happened from willing sellers, right? And we know that there's other projects that, had we had more time and ultimately more funds, would have come through as well. So at least from a statewide perspective, I could say that we're confident that we have a lot of different avenues to develop more units. And again, that flexibility is critical. And it's also important that we do it in a way that's in partnership with the community and the neighbors and stuff like that. So that's where our focus is. We know we have those opportunities, and we're going to actively be pursuing.
All right. Well, the final question is maybe one to aspire around. What does success look like for you, Geoff? I mean, relative to Homekey playing one key role in this crisis, but the other programs that you referenced earlier in your remarks also have to be working, and we have to have some measures of accountability. What does success look like from the state's perspective?
Let me hit on a few points. There's a concept of functional zero, which means we hope that we can prevent folks from falling into homelessness. But if you do fall into homelessness, that we can help you immediately and bring you back indoors, bring you into shelter if that's the immediate destination, but ultimately very quickly bring you back into permanent housing. Having that ability across the state for all of our folks in need is what success ultimately will look like. And so we're not there yet. We're making strides, but we haven't gotten there yet. So that's my aspirational goal. And I know that that's the aspirational goal of many that are working on this, including, again, higher up the chain, my bosses, right? The other piece is that your likelihood of needing that assistance isn't based on where you come from or where you live or the color of your skin or anything like that, right? That we've also started to really address equity in the appropriate manner, and that we start to overcome some of these legacies that we're having to deal with. So it is making sure that we have a system that's truly responsive to need, and that a system that is fair and equitable for everyone. That's what success looks like. That's what I wake up in the morning excited to try and tackle and do. I'm not so naive to think I can do it by myself, but I'm not daunted by the fact that we can't achieve these. I think we can, right? And so that to me is what success looks like. I know to a lot of my team members, I mean, we talk about this all the time. That's what we aspire to. And so that's what we're shooting for.
That's great. And I want to just add from my perspective that success also requires all of the stakeholders, our business community, our philanthropic community, our community-based organizations, and the public sector working together to really hold ourselves accountable to scaling interventions that work so that we can actually, as you say, get to functional zero. That's certainly AllHome's goal. And I know that everyone, the members of the Bay Area Council and everyone on this call is really eager to figure out what assets they can bring to expediting the solutions that you all are leading on. So thank you so much for this conversation today. And it's been awesome. And I think we're just about at time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And I hope this was at least a little informative. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today.
And thank you folks for tuning in. As I said, this will be available on the Bay Area Council's YouTube website. So you'll be able to go back and listen and see some of Geoff's slides and hear the conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.